You're very, very welcome to our third panel for the PSA Parliaments Annual Conference. This is the third of a series of panels which we've been hosting online in lieu of our usual two-day conference, which we were unable to have last autumn for the reasons of COVID. So we have been making the most of digital technology to bring you the latest and greatest scholarship in parliamentary studies. And indeed, that is the topic, or that's related to the topic that brings us together today. So we're very fortunate to have 4 great papers today that look at the impact of digital technology and social media on parliaments. First up, we're going to hear from Ben Worthy, and Ben's paper is titled, "Who is Monitoring Parliament?" Secondly, we'll have John Bryden, who's joined by his colleague Nicholas Luena, and their paper is on how Facebook influences Parliament. Thirdly, then, Sue Griffiths and Emily Death, their paper is on international approaches to virtual parliaments. And then lastly, we're going to hear from Benjamin Monnery and Olivier Rosenberg, and their paper is titled, "Members of Parliament Go Back to School, a Natural Experiment of Relative Performance Feedback and Parliamentary Activities in the French Parliament." And without further ado then, I'll bring us to our first speaker, and that is Ben Worthy. So over to you, Ben.
Thank you. And thank you so much for everybody who organised this. It's not been the easiest time to organise any events. So I just want to talk a little bit about this project that we've been working on, about who is watching Westminster, this idea of monitory democracy at Westminster. We're 14 months into a 2-year project, which looks at how people are using new forms of data, new platforms to monitor what it is MPs and peers are doing. So I'm going to talk you through some of the provisional findings, but it would be wonderful to get any of your ideas, thoughts, and indeed your criticism. There's just me speaking today, but I'm working with my colleague Stephanie Lange-Hennig. So just as a little bit of background, this idea of monitory democracy is part of a sort of broad family of ideas around democracy that look at the way in which different groups watch what political elites are doing. It's linked to these ideas about democracy as this sort of process of continuous oversight and surveillance, this idea of a constant sort of watching, and also linked to the idea that democracy, rather than pursuing agreement, is actually often about conflict. And here's two of the big thinkers in this area, but there are many others. What they have in common is this idea that democracy is about oversight and surveillance. It's also about different groups acting as watchdogs. These two thinkers in particular argue that being watched brings about better accountability from political elites. John Keane talks a lot about this idea that it will create more humility, but it can have other consequences, such as an encouragement of kind of political uses of data and sort of muckraking. Where they disagree is actually how new this is. John Keane talks a lot about the newness of monetary democracy that arrived after 1945, but has been powered by new technology. Rosenvallen talks rather differently about the idea that this sort of democracy has always been there, but it's often been submerged and sort of hidden. Where they do agree is that it's powered by a mixture of curiosity from different groups, skepticism and distrust. Rosenvallen famously talks about the idea that this sort of democracy is powered by distrust. And the big open question is whether this sort of surveillance democracy is replacing existing forms of democracy, is it undermining them, or is it just sort of complementing them? So when we talk about these different platforms and data, what are we talking about? You're probably pretty familiar with most of these platforms, things like They Work For You, Public Whip. You've got Parliament's own data service, which tells you all sorts of things. You've got IPSA that publishes data about MPs' expenses. Then you've got innovations like this platform, which allows you just to search either for single MPs or compare MPs in terms of their expenses. And then there's a whole range of other suites, some of which you know. You've got the Freedom of Information Act, of course, and sort of legal routes into accessing information, all the way to things like this. This is a bot that tells you every time somebody with a parliamentary IP address has made a change to a Wikipedia page. It's all anonymous, but you can often kind of guess who's doing what there. So the big question when we look at what sort of impact this monitoring is happening is actually who is using it, because that will define very much what happens with it. And you've got this mixture of the usual and the not so usual suspects. Of course, journalists heavily use this, both national journalists, investigative journalists, but also local and regional journalists. Interestingly, it's the local and regional monitoring that unnerves MPs most, especially when they do these kind of mini lists of who are the biggest users of expenses, how did particular regional MPs vote on certain issues. Political activists, local associations, and of course opponents always use things like voting data, expenses data against incumbents. And then you get campaigners using this data as well. And I mean both single issue campaigners, like the example there, but also issue-based campaigners. So if you think about the Electoral Reform Society, who spend a lot of time monitoring what members of the House of Lords are doing to kind of help build the case about future changes. Then you get actually the not so usual suspects, the slightly surprising users. Academics play a big part in data analysis. People like Chris Hanretti, but also someone like Meg Russell, who did some really interesting work looking at which MPs were really voting to block Brexit. Then you get members and staff themselves. They seem to use this data both to see how they're doing in the rankings, but also as a way of analysing opponents. Keir Starmer, only a few weeks ago, mentioned Boris Johnson's absence from a particular vote in Prime Minister's questions. Probably the big democratic question is, well, what about the public? And here, using a concept like Arnold's idea about the attentive versus the inattentive public, although that's a bit of a broken down area now. The attentive public are involved, but the wider public do get to hear about this data, both through the kind of sudden upsurges of attention with sort of controversy over MPs' pay rises or expenses use, and also more generally the way in which this data can play to certain political narratives. So the big question is, does it matter? And does it achieve some of these aims that the theorists hoped for? Well, it does seem to bring about more accountability of MPs at an individual level. You see more, for example, formal apologies in the House of Commons. You see MPs taking more time to explain what they're doing in terms of votes and offer justifications. For groups of MPs and MPs as a whole, this data creates a kind of set of measures and yardsticks by which you can measure what it is they're doing. One of the interesting ways in which this data is used is to create a kind of heuristic for revealing something about an MP. Where do they stand on certain issues, symbolic issues, and also anticipatory in the sense of how might they vote in the future. It has some interesting effects on political representation. It kind of extends and defines what a representative should do. A representative should vote in a certain way, but they should also be frugal with their expenses. They should attend at certain points and do certain things. The monitoring also kind of seems to bend and challenge a bit some of these old discussions between trustees versus delegates. The wonderful example is John Redwood on his blog during the single-sex marriage bill debate. John Redwood, not normally an MP noted for his sort of pragmatic approach to things, simply wrote on his blog, I haven't decided which way to vote, so I'm going to vote whichever way most of you write to me and tell me to. And you'll be very surprised to know that he voted no. In terms of participation, there's been some interesting crowdsourcing experiments coming out of the MP's expenses, also the way in which it kind of leads to other action. So you see that there's an expose of the possibility of MP's pay being increased, then there's an e-petition that follows it up quite quickly, and the way in which this data kind of forms a part of everyday political discussion on social media and elsewhere. One question we're finally trying to deal with is to what extent this data has been used to push particular reforms. Of course, the MP's expenses scandal is one really, really good example of how data has driven change. But you do get others. The Sun's list of lazy MPs, inverted commas, actually helped pressure for the first proxy vote changes. And for the House of Lords, for example, the discussion around what peers are doing, where peers come from, whether they've been attending, how they use expenses, plays into these larger discussions about the size of the House of Lords, its legitimacy and its future. So just to conclude very briefly, here's a few ideas that we're currently kind of turning over, so I'd welcome any thoughts on this. This data and this kind of monetary approach is not transforming democracy or undermining old ideas of democracy, but one thing that it is doing is creating a sort of new set of measures and new triggers for new sorts of conflict. An open question is whether this kind of new data actually reinforces sort of age-old prejudices about politicians. The second point is that a lot of the hopes for this data is that it would create these sort of almost objective measures of what politicians are doing, but we need to remember that this data is used almost all the time in an inherently political way, whether it's a candidate using an MP's voting record against them, all the way to the way in which, you know, data has made it appear as if Remain MPs are blocking Brexit. And it's important to remember what this data does and doesn't tell us. It does open up certain areas, but other areas are left very obscure. So we get a very particular picture of what MPs and to a lesser extent peers are doing, but we know little about some of the other less measurable parts. It kind of allows different members of the public to build their own democracy in some sense, but it also decontextualizes and misrepresents to an extent what politicians are doing. So that's a kind of quick run through where we are at the minute. If anybody can think of any examples or cases, we're looking for kind of nice case studies that demonstrate how this works. Any ideas for methods? We want to start doing a few sort of living labs with students where they do their own searches. And if there's anyone you think we should speak to, I'm aware there's some people in the audience who've already been very helpful. I want to say a big thank you to them. And a thank you to everybody for listening.